There's very little in these images, but why do they work so well? Would you believe that most of these images are actually just images of local landscape? And when we take pictures of local landscapes, why do they tend to end up being so meh? But there is a beauty to local landscapes, and the key to unlocking it is to use negative space. Negative space isn't the part of the photo which is bad per se, and it's very different from dead space. Dead space can refer to parts of the photo which are visually uninteresting and were left there because of poor composition. Negative space is purposely embedded into the photo to visually contrast against the subject so that both can complement one another. It is purposely left blank to do that. Negative space doesn't have to be blank though. It can be filled with color, it can be filled with texture, pattern, but the gist of it is that it will try to not create something very visually interesting, but complement the subject instead. Think of all the portrait photos you've seen with blurred backgrounds. If it was just white, it wouldn't be as visually appealing. Similarly, if there was a lot of distractions and it wasn't as blurry, then the background would have interesting subjects that might distract from the main person instead. And so having that blur is actually a form of creating negative space so that the subject can stand out, but still have an interesting environment where that subject is located. So why am I saying that negative space does so much for local landscapes? Well, we've gotten so used to looking at our local landscapes and thinking of it as very busy, very uninteresting. And when there is something interesting, when we try to take a photo of it, it's usually marred by all the distracting elements that get in the way. We aren't able to focus on the specific subject such that when we look back at the photo, it's just filled with distractions and we can't really appreciate what we saw because our eyes got used to looking at the subject, whereas our photo also includes all the distractions that we weren't paying attention to. With an emphasis on negative space, we preserve the essence of the local scene, making sure that we can relate to it, making sure that other people in our local areas could relate to it as well, but also still trying to do justice to the subject so that we can highlight the unique features of our local landscape. So today I want to give you 12 tips on how to create better photos with negative space, especially in your local landscapes. Number 1. Look for bodies of water. A lot of local landscapes do have bodies of water, whether it's a pond, whether it's a lake or a river. Those bodies of water will allow you to create a backdrop for your subjects of interest and will create the negative space for you, especially if they're still. Number 2, street lighting at night. During night, it is very dark, and what the street light does is it casts its light on a very specific location, especially if it's maybe an isolated street lamp. So what I've done usually is to look for those subjects which are just about to walk through those light and really highlight that subject within the light, whereas everything else around it becomes negative space. So there's no distraction of railings or cars moving around. It's pure darkness with a little bit of light with the subject in that light, and it really creates a very aesthetic photo. Tip number 3 is to use the Goldilocks amount. You can have too much negative space and you can have too little negative space. You need to have a good ratio between negative space and the subject so that your subject doesn't get lost in the negative space. And if your subject is too large against the negative space, it just becomes a photo about the subject and there isn't really any negative space that will kind of enhance and complement it more. Number 4, think of fog as so much more than just a hindrance to drive in. Fog is one of my most favorite ways to create negative space because it will reduce so many distracting elements behind the subject that you're interested in. A lot of my local landscapes are filled with trees, and a lot of people do like taking pictures of trees. Now, the trees usually have a lot of other things behind them that kind of make the tree get lost in the photo. Having fog in your local landscape will allow you to create the negative space needed for that tree to stand out against everything else in the background. Number 5. Use your telephoto lens if you have one, especially if you have one on your phone camera. The telephoto lens will allow you to get much closer to the subject that you're interested in and reduce the amount of distracting elements outside of the photo. A lot of times we can't physically get close to a certain subject, and using a telephoto lens, we're able to at least optically get closer to the subject. That way we can reduce the distracting elements around it, maybe find them in isolation and use that to really enhance the subject and preserve some level of separation so that there is enough negative space around the subject as well. Number 6, using overcast skies and getting over the golden hour. Golden hour does tend to create really beautiful photos, but it can also increase a lot of interest within parts of the image that you might not want to if you're trying to preserve negative space. By having golden hour light shine on a certain space when you're trying to take a photo, it can create interesting light, but those spaces then also have shadows and light interacting there, and it becomes less about just the subject, but more about the entire photo. Sure, it can definitely create a decent photo, but if you're trying to really enhance the subject and preserve a negative space, golden light might not be the best. And using overcast skies when you have a cloudy day can create those negative spaces better for you. Number 7, use textures and repeating patterns that you find in your local areas. So for me, I live in an area which is surrounded by a farm. And so when I do see crops starting to come out, I will try to use the patterns in those crops to create a sense of negative space. Because if it's a repeating pattern of the crops or the plant life, I can still make the subject stand out because it is the one thing in that image or the major thing in that image that doesn't match with that pattern, and so it stands out visually from the rest of the field. And so try to find those patterns and textures in your local landscapes as well. Number 8, try to use more of an open aperture to create a blur. Usually for landscape photography, I am very focused on trying to create very sharp photos from front to back, but sometimes I do tend to use an open aperture to create more of a blur and focus on a very specific point where my subject is and let everything else become blur, similar to how portraits are taken. Number 9, silhouettes. When you have a subject that appears as a silhouette, although that subject will be dark, it can still be classified as a subject. Now, when you pitch them against a different backdrop, that backdrop can act as negative space for that silhouette, and it can create really interesting photos, especially when you don't want to capture the details, but just want to capture the shapes and the geometry of the scene. Number 10, use Photoshop if you can, but very conservatively. Sometimes when you take a photo, you can tend to see some little distraction that if only they weren't there, they might make for a great photo because you'll be able to preserve the negative space. Usually my rule of thumb is to only remove small objects and objects that would not be there had I taken the photo maybe the next day, right? So if it's a bird that flew in the way or something like that, maybe I'll get rid of it, but I try to preserve the landscape as it is. But if it's a house that's in the way, then I won't try and remove it because I know that my composition doesn't reflect the landscape as well as I should have been able to. Number 11, use cropping, but remember the format. So cropping can play a great role when you're trying to take a photo, especially if you don't have a telescopic lens. Cropping can allow you to remove the distractions and isolate the subject in that negative space that you want to. But remember the format that you will be actually sharing your image in, especially if you shoot with your camera phone. They're usually fine for looking on your phone, but if you want to create a print, remember that any cropping will really affect the quality of the photo because you will have reduced the number of megapixels by just cropping them out. And finally, number 12, the positioning of the negative space actually matters, especially when you're trying to convey movement. For example, if the subject has direction of their own, because maybe it's a pointed direction, maybe they're walking in a certain direction, then having the negative space positioned relative to them can really complement their movement as well. All right, thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed this video and hope you find these tips really useful for creating negative spaces within your local landscapes. And I hope to see you next time. Bye.